Hello. Hey, everybody. It's Greg Smith. We are without Jay Foreman this week, but I am joined this week by Derek Peterson, staff writer at Hail Varsity, and managing editor Brandon Vogel at Hail Varsity to talk about kind of the big news of the day with sophomore wide receiver Wan'Dale Robinson deciding to leave the Nebraska program.
This is the Straight Up Breakdown Podcast with Greg Smith and Jay Foreman.
Exclusively on the Hurrdat Media Network.
Tell it to me straight up.
Hey everyone, this is Greg Smith, and I am joined by Derek Peterson and Brandon Vogel. Yes, we are here for kind of an emergency podcast, YouTube session to discuss kind of the big news of the day, right? Like we had big news that was kind of brewing throughout the weekend and then came to a head on Monday afternoon as star wide receiver, sophomore Wan'Dale Robinson announced that he would be leaving the Nebraska football program and entering his name into the transfer portal. There are a number of ways that we can go on this. It is a huge impact for Nebraska football, both on the field and off the field. And I guess I kind of want to start here with both of you guys, and we'll start with Brandon. When you saw the news come out and you saw Wan'Dale's statement, what was your first reaction to the news?
First reaction was not total shock because, as you mentioned, I think we kind of got wind that maybe there was the chance of this, but still to see what is, I think, pretty inarguably one of Nebraska's two or three best players, maybe its best player, and that's before you even get into any of the other contexts, which I'm sure we'll get into as we go through this. To see a player like that depart, like nothing about that is good. I'm a little bit in terms of the on-field things, in terms of the real impact on Nebraska as it turns the page to 2021. We can talk about that a little bit. I've got some thoughts on that, but this was the guy that you put up there when you introduced your new facilities, when you did the breaking ground on that, or at least the announcement of that. This was the guy who hung Christmas ornaments on Austin Allen. Like he was the face. His usage rate backed that up. So to lose a guy like that, like it's not going to go well in terms of public perception.
Yeah, and Derek, what were your thoughts when you first saw the news?
Can I swear on this podcast?
You can. Go for it.
Oh shit. I mean, like there is a tendency when guys leave that for people to say, okay, next man up, or okay, we want people that want to be here. Any kind of statement of that nature. I think sometimes there's a little bit to that, but at the same time, you don't want to lose talent. And Wan'Dale Robinson was the most talented player on this offense. For 2 years in a row, that's been the case. I think, Brandon, you and I, well, the whole group really, we kind of talked about this off pod a little bit and just kind of trying to dissect like what is the real on-field impact of losing Wan'Dale Robinson in the short term. So immediate next season, what is the impact of losing him? What does he do to this offense? Is it a difference of a touchdown a game? Well, maybe not, because, like how many touchdowns does he have in his career? Not a ton. Like I think I broke down the numbers. I should have them in front of me, but I don't. I broke down the numbers kind of for a defining number series. I think he was averaging a touchdown every 32 touches or something absurd like that. Like, so the impact isn't huge. And to Brandon's point, and not to like steal his point, but this is kind of what he said was like, their issues are so much bigger than Wan'Dale Robinson that Wan'Dale Robinson alone doesn't fix everything, because he wasn't fixing everything. But at the same time, when this came down and I kind of read through his statement and then I sat back in my chair and thought about it, I was like, okay, what is big picture? What does this mean? This was a guy that he was on the podium whenever they announced their facilities. Like Brandon said, he was hanging Christmas lights on Austin Allen. He was the face of this program, And, to lose a guy who, by all accounts, was as invested in Scott Frost as anyone on the team. He believed through the first 2 years of his career here, the public facing persona was that he believed in Scott Frost. He believed in this offense. He believed in where they were going, where they were headed, and their ability to get over the hump. To lose that guy and kind of, it's just another in a string of wide receiver losses or wide receiver misses or whatever. That's a problem in and of itself. But to lose that guy that was your most staunch defender publicly, I mean, I think it says something about the program where it's at right now and what the trajectory is for it.
Yeah, and I think that that's kind of where my mind went immediately in the immediate aftermath, and as soon as the statement kind of officially came out, because as you both kind of said, we kind of had been talking about this for a couple of days as if it was going to come down, but it's always another thing when it actually officially comes out and it hits, right? The popular saying that it hits different, right? And it did, because and to me it's immediately about the big picture and what this says about kind of the Frost era, where it's going from here, like the immediate impact of guys that are coming into your program right now from the 2021 class, because of course I always naturally go right to recruiting. Like it's just, I think it's an enormous impact on the program, because if you really start to think about, and we all I think are in agreement that Wan'Dale was the face of the program. I think it even goes beyond that, because there are only so many Huskers that national writers, that Big Ten writers that don't cover Nebraska on a daily basis like we do, they can only name, 3 or 4 Huskers, right? Like if you really, zoom it out. And Wan'Dale Robinson is always going to be on that list. Like, and I think that means something. And I did immediately also think about the fact that Wan'Dale was there to unveil the new facility and be the guy ushering Nebraska into a new future. To me, he was the representation of where this offense was supposed to be going under Scott Frost, because he was exactly the type of player that this offense has always featured everywhere that it's been. And that was in part what was sold to him on the recruiting trail. Like, I just think that it represents so many different kind of misses and failures that we've seen along the way so far. And it just kind of encapsulates them all into one.
Yeah, he believed enough in it to flip from Kentucky, from the very start. And, who knows if that's where he ends up. We don't know that at this point. That seems to be the rumor. He mentioned in his statement being somewhere closer to home. So it seems like a pretty natural fit, given that he was committed there once. And it hurts a lot from all of those perspectives of just, he bought it, he bought in and he gave you everything he had. Like, I don't think anybody can dispute that. Like, ironically, the amount Nebraska had to use him at running back may have contributed at least a little bit to this. We don't know. We'll see as more comes out, I guess. But he did whatever you asked. And like, you gave him the ball. I mean, I'll have to tally it up, but he had over 100 touches as a freshman and as a sophomore. And I'm guessing there's probably 5 players in the country that got the ball as often as he did. Like, he was Nebraska's break in case of emergency guy, certainly this year, and even a little bit in 2019 of like, hey, we're struggling, things aren't working, like for whatever reason, this isn't going the way we want it to. Like, we're just going to give it to our best guy. That guy was Wan'Dale, and it probably hurt his numbers to a degree. And we'll see if just being in a different offense changes that. I think it depends a lot on which offense it is, but there's no way around it. Like, he's a super talented player. I loved the guy just as a football player. Like, he did everything he asked, and he played football the right way. And that's going to be tough to replace. I don't think it sinks Nebraska necessarily, but not in a football perspective. But for all the reasons you guys kind of brought up, like, it's going to be tough for people to swallow.
He averaged 10 yards a catch. So in his two Nebraska seasons, which will be his Nebraska career, he had 91 catches for 914 yards. So 10 yards a catch. It's pretty clean. Is that too low? about where it should be given that duck R position, or is that too low? Because on its surface, it seems like it's too low.
Yeah, I would say my initial reaction is that it is a little low given the way that they would probably have wanted to use him in an ideal world. And so, yeah, too low is probably my first initial reaction there. Brandon, do you feel the same?
Not gut reaction. No, I'm like pulling up right now. 10-year, well, maybe. Yeah, you don't even make the top 100 on CFB stats if you're averaging 10 yards a catch. I think some of that, I looked at some numbers kind of immediately after this decision came down officially at his expected points added. So you're just kind of measuring even the 2-yard runs, like what's he adding to the offense? And he was much higher in 2019. I think you can attribute a lot of that to JD Spielman when you had a secondary receiver like here. And we knew this to be the case a little bit, but I don't think any of us expected Nebraska's offense to be as limited as it was in 2020. But without him, that number decreased by more than 50%. Like it was big, and he kept getting touches, but they just had less and less impact because everyone knew like that's where Nebraska went when they needed to get something going. So yeah, 10 is probably too low now that I look at it a little bit. I think, and this is part of why I think the offense is still lagging behind a lot. Like they need more guys. They need guys who can be like, okay, if you're going to focus on WanDale, we're going to make you pay here. And I don't know that Nebraska had that in 2020, maybe a little bit in 2019 with the JD Spielman, but that's part of why I'm kind of like, well, you're almost like totally zeroing the scale for the Huskers at wide receiver right now, because the guy you gave it to all the time who, may or may not have been unhappy with how he was used or unhappy with what it was producing, it wasn't impacting things enough, which isn't a slight at WanDale at all. It just more speaks to Nebraska's offense as a whole.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of an interesting point to kind of dovetail off of, because I think that going forward, as you look at the offense next year, it's kind of interesting to me because on one hand, there's no way to really refute what you're saying, Brandon, which is that essentially like the statistics don't necessarily bear out the impact that you automatically assign to WanDale. But that doesn't mean that we don't all recognize that they're losing their best offensive player, right? But that also it means too that Nebraska doesn't have anyone that you look at right now on the roster and say, oh yeah, that guy's going to replace that production. But I could also make the argument that they have several guys that I could see being pretty good and then making them a more well-rounded offense. Like there is a case to be made where, okay, so they just picked up the senior transfer, Torre, right? And comes in for FCS from Montana. So if you had him and you have Xavier Betts take another step and Omar Manning comes back, Austin Allen continues the progression that he's on. Thomas Fedoni comes in and is what we think he's going to come in and be. And then maybe Alante Brown is what you were hearing that he was previously. You're like, okay, I probably right there just named off 5 or 6 guys that are pass catchers right off the top of my head and was probably missing someone. Yes, that could produce a good offense. But the counter to that would be, what evidence have we seen of that actually being able to just flip that switch and work the way that it should have and has always intended to be under Frost? Because the offense that I just laid out is exactly what it was supposed to be all along. We're just talking about different guys and entering year 4 than we were when Frost first got here.
That's where I was going to go. This is kind of my issue with the line of thinking of, well, Nebraska just needs more guys. Nebraska has guys. Wan'Dale Robinson was what Miles Jones was supposed to be, but wasn't because of usage. You just not get an opportunity. How many guys can you go down the list of the skill position players that they've recruited in the last 3 years that have gotten Zero. No opportunity. Nothing. Like I don't believe gamers are a thing. And certainly with this coaching staff, if you don't practice well during the week, you're not getting on the field on Saturdays. But Demarion Houston, Jamie Nance, Chris Hickman, those guys have been here for a little bit. We don't get to see what they look like on the field. We don't even know what they look like. Chris Hickman was talked about a ton in the spring, and sure, maybe the COVID shutdown impacted things, but on the field, he was relegated to a blocking role on fourth down packages. That was it. Nothing. They need wide receiver talent, and they have a 6 foot, however tall he is, guy over there that they're not even using. Marcus Fleming had 5 catches for 75 yards in his second career game, and then nothing before transferring. Alante Brown is a kickoff only guy. They have it. This was my issue with, like, oh, we're too young, or oh, we don't have enough pieces, or oh, we need this or we need that. Like, you have those guys. They're there. They're on the sideline. In a lot of instances, they're standing on the sideline, not being used. You look at guys that have left. Were they stunted by coming to Nebraska? So when you talk about guys that are still here and you say, well, can they make the next step? What evidence do we have that suggests that they can do that with this coaching staff? Did Wan'Dale Robinson get better in his 2 years at Nebraska? Was he better in 2020 than he was in 2019?
I would argue that he was basically the same. We got to see towards the end of the season him utilize a little bit more as a wide receiver, so we got to see some more of those skills. But you could also come back to me and say, well, we just didn't see that as much in the 2019 season. So I could go either way on that.
So, like, can we definitively say that Xavier Betts is going to be better next year than he was this year, or Alante Brown is going to be better next year than he was this year? Which is kind of the problem, right? Like, Dedrick Mills was expected to take a step forward, and he didn't take a step forward, partially because the usage was just all over the place. The opportunity was all over the place. So, like, and this is like the biggest picture thing that is kind of punctuated. Like, WanDale is the exclamation mark on this, of like, recruiting is a lifeblood of a program. And I think guys now, the motivation is different for playing college football. The motivation is different than it was 20 years ago, where we want to win a national championship. We want to play in a cool bowl. We want to win a bowl game, things like that. I watched Oklahoma State play Miami, and Miami's starting quarterback got hurt. And then Tylan Wallace, who is one of the best wide receivers in the country, who is an NFL prospect, a draftable player, looked at that and said, yeah, I'm out, and opted out mid-game. Didn't play the second half, mid-game. The motivation now seems to be, who can get me to the NFL? Who can get me to the next level? Who can make me better and get me to the next level? And there are guys that are going to want to go play at Alabama and Clemson and Ohio State because they want to play for a national championship. But in most instances, the motivation is, who can get me to the NFL? The local kid that's going to North Dakota State to play quarterback, some of his motivation was, they can get me to the NFL. So when you have guys that are either not getting better or staying the same, or saying, I want to go someplace else because I feel like, my future potential is bigger elsewhere, that is one of the most damning things that you can say about a college football program in this day and age.
Yeah, it's tough. I think there's an issue here of potentially identification and development, as you were talking about with wide receivers. Like, I think so far through 3 recruiting cycles, and they've got 80 or 90% of their 4th recruiting class signed at this point, like, it's been almost a total miss on the wide receiver front, minus Wan'Dale Robinson, who's now leaving. Maybe not a total miss. I mean, there's some guys that are just too young to say one way or the other. But you look back to that 2018 class, the junior college guys you brought in to give you immediate help for what everybody admitted, coaching staff included, was a position where the numbers weren't where they wanted them to be, where the talent wasn't where they wanted them to be. So you're looking at Mike Williams and Jerron Woodyard. Both those guys ended up, well, Mike Williams played but left kind of unhappy. Jerron Woodyard transferred and played for Marshall this year. Like, he was a factor for them. He wasn't their leading receiver. But so I think there's a combination of misses there Um, there's also like the offense isn't where they thought it would be. No way, no how. And I mean, Frost has said as much too. After 3 years, and some of that contributes too. Like if Nebraska's putting up more yards, Wan'Dale Robinson gets more of those yards. So that's why it's so tough to kind of parse, and everywhere you turn, it's a little chicken or the egg of are his numbers lower than what you would expect based on his talent because of the offense, or like, does his talent get inflated a little bit? And I'm not saying this is a slight to Wan'Dale at all. Like, I want to make that clear. Like I said, I love the guy as a football player, but because he's Nebraska's first player, because he was such a high profile recruit, like he gets elevated as, well, this is our best guy. He's at Nebraska, traditionally one of the best programs in the country. He's got to be one of the best in the country. And I don't know if we know that yet either. And who knows why that's the case. It's just kind of the way things shook out, which takes me back to like Nebraska's got such big issues to address offensively that the loss of one guy hurts. I mean, this is as big a loss of one guy as you could have. It's just hard for me to like downgrade or upgrade my view on the 2021 season too much based on that.
Yeah, I think that to that point about the singular loss of Wan'Dale being the biggest one, I don't think that there's another player that would have, and I think offense or defense, I think that if JoJo Domann had not elected to come back, I still think it's a bigger deal that Wan'Dale doesn't go, because even then in JoJo's case, oh, he's a senior coming back for an extra year. If it was Cam Taylor-Britt, oh, he wanted to take a shot at the NFL. He got a good draft grade. I don't think there's a person that could have left that would have had more, that would have generated these types of discussions. It's kind of the big picture, like, is this a crisis kind of a situation? What do they need to look into? Because to Derek's point, and I'm glad you mentioned this, when you brought up like Mike, I think it was either brought up Mike Williams and Jerron Woodyard in that first class. Like, we've seen kind of these mismanagement issues, like underutilization issues since then. Because if you remember back to what the coaching staff was saying about even those guys when they first got here, they can take a top off of defense. Everyone's picturing in your mind they're going to get vertical in the passing game with guys like that. And it just never happened. And that started kind of this snowball effect that we've seen with so many different wide receivers. And it's funny that it's funny isn't the right word. It's kind of ironic that it is all kind of focused in on the wide receiver. And we've talked so much about that, obviously, because of Wan'Dale being a wide receiver. But that is where the biggest glaring issue to me has been in the program. I think there's, I tweeted out earlier, they recruited 17 wide receivers under Frost. 7 of them either didn't make it or transferred out early. 2 of them, Kanawai Noah and Mike Williams, finished their time in Lincoln. And then 6 are still here. But if you really want to get inside of that 6, like, they have 17 total catches in their entire careers. And there's guys like Derek mentioned, Demarion Houston, Jamie Nance, that you wouldn't be surprised if they moved on, at some point this offseason as well. And so it's just been a lot of misses, and it's just such a glaring thing. And I don't know how you fix that, and if they recognize that that's a huge issue. But I kind of want to go here next with you guys, is that what is, and I don't want to say like, oh, find a silver lining in this, but to me, the very first thing that I thought about how they can kind of move forward from this is, you're going to still again be, I guess, young or green at wide receiver next year, is, does this force Nebraska to do what I've kind of been advocating for this offseason, and not really kind of, I've been saying it, I've written this several times, that they basically need to go to more of a power spread and have that be more of the identity. Can something like the Wan'Dale Robinson news push that along a little bit further?
I think so. I think, and again, like you said, no, we're not going out there looking for a Pollyanna-ish approach or a silver lining here just because it's what we have to deal with. But I think in some ways it kind of underscores a little bit of like, hey, having him was a little bit of a security blanket. Like I've said, when things got tough, find Wan'Dale. And that's a good strategy, and it's a legitimate strategy because he was that good. Here, it's like, okay, we might have to manufacture some more stuff, especially if we're going to be young at wide receiver. It puts the highlight, I think, back on the run game and the offensive line, which I've kind of always maintained is like, until this offense is able to run the ball at like top 2 or 3 level in the Big Ten, it's probably not where it wants to be. And if you can do that, then yeah, you can be a little bit green at wide receiver, because if teams have to gear up to stop the run, guys should be open. I mean, and the offense has always gotten guys open.
Yeah, guys were open this year. Yeah, guys were open.
It's been a matter of finding them and finding them consistently. So maybe it highlights that a little bit. I mean, I think in some ways, my kind of big picture overall view is that, yeah, maybe it kind of says, okay, it hurts to lose that guy, but your issues were bigger than that anyway. So let's really focus on those, because now the option of getting the ball to Wan'Dale is no longer there. You got to come up with something else.
Yeah, Brandon's point about Wan'Dale being sort of the break in case of emergency guy is really, really accurate. And I want to give credit where credit is due. Brandon is the one that brought up Mike Williams and Jerome.
Oh, okay.
I did not do that, but I'm glad that he did bring up Mike Williams, because like of the non-Wan'Dale wide receivers that have been recruited, he's the one that's produced the most, and it's only 231 yards. And when he left, he made no bones about the fact that he wasn't really used properly. So I mean, they could go to that run first approach that you kind of asked about, that we thought that they might be able to do this year. I think the jury is still out though, because they had a guy that was tailor made for that kind of approach in Dedrick Mills, and at least to me, it seemed like they were more comfortable running the quarterback than they were with designed running back carries. And like to Brandon's point, like I think they were second in the conference in yards per carry as a rushing offense, or second in the conference in yards per game as a rushing offense. But a lot of that is a quarterback. How much of that is juiced by quarterback scramble or quarterback draw or things like that? Or quarterback draw picks up 7 yards when you're in 3rd and 23 and you don't want to do anything else because you can't do anything else.
Right.
So, we'll see. I'm in agreement with Brandon though, that like in the immediate near future, losing Wan'Dale, while it sucks, kind of face value, like there are other issues that need to be sorted out.
Yeah, I think that it's funny to be like the Dedrick Mills question that I guess is still, again, it's still looming out there about whether or not he's returning or not, because he's made no official statement as of recording this podcast, is now even more important, right? Like you could make the argument, though this ends up being another point against the staff and development, that even if Dedrick Mills announces tomorrow that he's coming back to Nebraska, let's run this thing back, I am your bell cow, you could argue that they still should bring in another transfer running back so that they could lean on the running game even more, so they can give some of those carries away from Adrian Martinez. But then that brings up the other side of the development issue that we've had at wide receiver, and we've talked about at length at wide receiver. That's starting to rear its ugly head at running back as well, right? Like, I mean, when you think about the Wan'Dale as break in case of emergency option, that was often as the backup running back, or sometimes the primary running back in this offense, where I'm actually more surprised that they consistently continue to do that than whatever happened at wide receiver, because the word out of the staff, both publicly and privately, about how they felt about those running backs that they've signed over the last couple of years was just so positive that it's surprising to me that you look up and, Dedrick Mills has a big run, gets him down in the red zone, and then Wan'Dale Robinson is the guy to come in and run the ball in between the tackles when you have, Marvin Scott. I think Savion Morrison dressed for that particular game. Ramir Johnson has been just kind of a mystery speaking of usage, of how he's been utilized. Like, I just think that running back position now is going to come into even more focus now because it's kind of been in flux and all over the place as well.
Yeah, it definitely has. And like you said, we'll see what happens with Mills. Like, this is not based on anything other than my own gut feel. I'd be surprised if he comes back. And then Nebraska's super young and unproven at that spot. So, you look in the transfer market there. I mean, even talking about wide receiver, like they got a transfer wide receiver this week, shortly before WanDale announced he was leaving. Like, I think they could take 2 more. Like, maybe I'm crazy about that, but I honestly do, in terms of catching up to where I think they want to be in terms of numbers there. Like, if it fits and those guys are out there and they're willing to come, like, because you need a real talent infusion there, which isn't saying anything about any of the guys that they've signed where it's still early in their career. We'll see. But like you kind of alluded to, Greg, coming into the year, all the talk was about, WanDale's a wide receiver. We don't want to give him that many carries. That they did, I think, tells you a little bit about how 2020 went in terms of injuries and those sorts of things. But also, like, just how far or how not far some of those younger guys had come along to that point, assuming everybody was available.
It's kind of like Murphy's Law with this team. Anything that can go wrong will go wrong. And we've seen that with their wide receivers too, because it's not all of just like, oh, guys transferred. It was like, well, I mean, you had Andre Hunt, Katarian Legrone in there.
Right.
You had Dominic Watt, who never made it, who's in there. You had Will Nixon, who they liked, who thought that he could come in and pick up the offense right away, who got hurt. So, it's just I think the most ironic part of all of this is that Frost's come up at Oregon came from being a wide receivers coach.
Yeah, it definitely is kind of a grand irony there. But that's going to do it for us today for Straight Up Breakdown Podcast. Subscribe to the podcast everywhere you can listen to them. Rate us and review us. Leave us a 5-star review. If you only leave 4, I am inclined to think you are a hater. Make sure you are checking out all the other podcasts on the Hail Varsity Network, the Mind Your Own podcast, Varsity Club, More to It, and the Hail Varsity Radio Show. You can also email us and send all your love notes to straightupbreakdown@hailvarsity.com. You can find us on Twitter, and this is, I know mine, Greg Smith HB. Brandon, what's yours?
Brandon L. Vogel.
Derek?
DRPETEYHV.
So Dr. PDHB, we could say it that way. And we will catch you next time. Thanks for listening.
A Hurrdat Media Production.